I almost didn't go in. I stood outside that restaurant, some place called Harmon's, downtown, the kind of spot with a valet and a wine list thicker than my wrist. And I thought about turning around, getting back in my truck, and driving the 2 hours home to Clover Ridge. I'd done it before. Shown up somewhere I didn't belong, and felt it in my chest before I even opened the door. But my daughter had called me 3 times that week. She said it was important. She said he wanted to meet me properly. So I straightened my collar, walked through the door, and that's when I heard it. "Oh God," she said to her friend, loud enough that the hostess looked up. He actually wore that. I didn't know who she was yet. A young woman, early 30s, dark hair, the kind of dress that cost more than my monthly feed bill. She was looking directly at me, not past me, at me. At my boots, my Wranglers, my button-down that I'd ironed that morning because I thought it was a special occasion. She turned back to her friend and said, just quiet enough that she thought I couldn't hear, "My God, he smells like a barn. I do sometimes." After 38 years of working the same 200 acres in East Texas, some of that smell gets into you, into your skin, your hair, the fabric of things. I've never been ashamed of it. My late wife used to say I smelled like honest work. I believed her. But standing in that restaurant, I wanted to disappear. My daughter appeared from around the corner then, and she hugged me, and over her shoulder I could see the young woman watching us with something I can only describe as quiet horror. And then my daughter stepped back, and she said, "Dad, I want you to meet someone." The young woman smiled, put her hand out like nothing had happened. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you," she said. "Audrey talks about you constantly." Her name was Simone. And from that night, everything changed. I should tell you about Audrey first, because she's the reason any of this matters. She's my youngest, 31 years old. Her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness. She grew up on that land in Clover Ridge, spent summers baling hay, learned to drive a tractor before she learned to drive a car. When she was 12, she helped me deliver a calf at 2 in the morning, and she didn't complain once. She just held the flashlight steady and talked to the mother the whole time in a low, calm voice. After her mother passed, it'll be 7 years this April. Audrey was the one who called every Sunday without fail. She moved to Dallas for her job, something in commercial real estate, and she built herself a good life there. I was proud of her, still am, always will be, no matter what happened after. My son, Beckett, is different. Older by 6 years, quieter, more like me. He stayed close to home, works land of his own about 40 minutes north of my place. He doesn't call as often, but when he does, we talk for a long time. That's just how he is. Steady. You can count on him the way you count on the seasons. It was Beckett who first told me about Simone. We were out at the fence line on a Saturday, fixing a section the cattle had pushed through, and he said it real casual, the way he says everything. "You know anything about this woman Audrey's been seeing?" I said I knew she'd mentioned someone. Someone she worked with, or near, I couldn't remember exactly. Beckett pulled the wire taut and clipped it without looking at me. "I looked her up," he said. "Her family's in commercial development. Big money. They've had some trouble." I asked what kind of trouble. He shrugged. "The kind people don't talk about at dinner." I didn't press him then. Maybe I should have. The dinner at Harmon's was a month later. By then, Audrey had told me they were serious. She sounded happy in a way I hadn't heard since before her mother got sick. So I put what Beckett said in the back of my mind, and I drove into Dallas, and I ironed my shirt, and I walked through that door. Simone's parents were there too. Her father, a man named Philip Weston, was the kind of person who takes up more space than he physically occupies. He had silver hair and a firm handshake, and the practiced warmth of someone who had learned long ago that charm was a tool. He was wearing a jacket that probably cost more than my truck. His wife, a woman named Renata, sat beside him with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Philip ordered wine for the table without asking what anyone wanted. He called the waiter by his first name, though I don't think he'd ever met him before. He talked about a development project in Austin, a resort property they were partnering on, something with significant upside, and he watched me while he talked, measuring something. "Audrey tells us you have property out in East Texas," he said. "How many acres?" "About 200, I said. "Good land out there," he said, nodding slowly, like he was considering something. "Piney woods. Not a lot of arable, but the timber value's there. And of course, the right-of-way potential if the highway expansion ever comes through." He smiled. "Have you thought about what you'd do with it eventually?" I told him I planned to keep farming it. He laughed, not unkindly, but in the way of someone who has already decided what they think of you. "Of course," he said. "Of course." Audrey was quiet most of that dinner. She watched Simone the way you watch someone you're trying to learn, still figuring out all the edges. But she's laughed at the right moments. And she reached across and touched my hand once, and I thought, she's happy. Whatever this is, she's happy. That matters. It wasn't until we were walking out to the parking lot that Simone fell back beside me, just the two of us for a moment. And she said, very pleasantly, "My father really admires what you've built. He just thinks it's important for people to make wise decisions while they're still, sharp." She said it with a smile, the same smile. I didn't say anything, but I thought about it the whole drive home. The months that followed were some of the most disorienting of my life. Simone became a regular presence. She and Audrey drove out to Clover Ridge 3 times that fall. Simone always dressed like she was about to go somewhere better, not rude about it, just indifferent to where she actually was. She asked questions about the property the way a developer asks questions. Not curious, calculating. She asked if I had a will. She asked if I'd had the timber appraised recently. She asked, once while we were walking the south pasture, whether I'd ever considered a conservation easement. And when I said I wasn't sure I wanted to lock the land into restrictions, she nodded and said, "Of course, of course." It's just that some of those easement structures can be very favorable for estate planning purposes. She paused. Especially for older landowners who want to avoid probate complications for their heirs. I was 63 years old. I had just spent the morning fixing a water line in the north field. I was not at that point thinking about probate, but somebody was. Her father called me twice that winter. Both times he framed it as friendliness, checking in, the future family staying connected. Both times he worked the land into the conversation within about 4 minutes. He mentioned a developer he knew who was quietly interested in East Texas timber tracts. He mentioned that land values were peaking and that timing was everything in real estate. He mentioned that it might be worth sitting down with his estate attorney, as a favor, just to make sure everything was structured correctly. I told him I'd think about it. I called Beckett after the second call. Beckett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I need you to meet someone." Her name was Lorena Whitfield. She was a property attorney out of Lufkin, 40 years in practice, about as no-nonsense as a person can get. Beckett had found her through a friend of a friend, somebody who dealt with ranch estates and timber trusts, and the kind of legal architecture that keeps land in families for generations. I drove to Lufkin on a Tuesday and sat across from her for 2 hours. She asked me questions, real questions, about the deed, the mineral rights, the timber stand, the grazing leases, what I'd signed over the years, what I hadn't. She pulled up county records on her screen. She made notes in a yellow legal pad. She was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they actually understand what they're looking at. At the end, she set her pen down and looked at me. "You don't have a trust," she said. I said, "No, I had a will. Drawn up about 15 years ago." She nodded slowly. "A will goes through probate in Texas. That takes time. It's public record, and it can be contested." She paused. "Have you had any conversations recently with anyone about your estate?" Anyone expressing particular interest in how the property is structured? I told her about Philip Weston. I told her about the calls. I told her about the questions Simone asked on the south pasture. Lorena didn't react. She just wrote something on her pad. Here's what I'd recommend, she said. A revocable living trust. It keeps the land out of probate, transfers cleanly to whoever you designate, and it's not public record. Nobody outside this room and your chosen trustee needs to know it exists. I asked how long it would take. 6 to 8 weeks to do it right, she said. Longer if the timber rights need separate handling. I told her to start. Then I called Beckett from the parking lot and told him what we were doing. He was quiet again for a second, and then he said, "Good." That was all. Just good. That's my son. I want to be honest about something, because this is my story and I think it matters. I didn't tell Audrey, not because I don't trust her. I trust her with my life. But I wasn't sure at that point how deep she was in. Not in any conspiring way. I don't think my daughter is a bad person. I think she loved someone, and that love made her blind to things. Or maybe she saw them and told herself they didn't mean what they meant. Either way, I didn't want to put her in the middle of something before I knew exactly what the middle was. So I kept going to Sunday dinners. I kept being polite to Philip Weston on the phone. I kept answering Simone's questions about the property with just enough information to seem cooperative and not quite enough to be useful. And while I was doing that, Lorena was doing her work. The trust was finalized on a Wednesday in February. I signed the paperwork in Lorena's office with Beckett sitting beside me as the designated co-trustee. The land, all 200 acres, the timber rights, the mineral rights, the grazing leases, went into the trust. My house sits on a separate parcel, also in the trust. The beneficiaries are Audrey and Beckett, equally. The will still exists technically. It just doesn't have anything in it. I drove home that evening and cooked a pot of chili and watched the sun go down over the east pasture. The land looked the same as it always had. The light came through the pines the same way it's been coming through those pines my whole life. Nothing had changed out there, but something had changed in me. A tension I hadn't known I was carrying just released. I slept better that night than I had in months. Spring came. Audrey called to tell me that she and Simone had set a date. Late October, she said, a venue outside of Austin. She sounded nervous and happy in equal parts, the way she's always sounded when she's about to do something she really means. I said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'll be there." I meant it. Whatever happened, that was still my daughter. Philip Weston called me 2 weeks later. He said he wanted to have a conversation, man to man, about the family's future, about making sure everything was protected. He said that with the wedding coming up, it might be time to think about formalizing some things, and that his attorney could draw up a framework that would protect Audrey's interests in the property. Her interests, I said. Well, yes, he said. If something were to happen to you, it would be important for her to be able to move quickly. These things can get complicated in probate. We just want to make sure there's no unnecessary delay or conflict. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I'd been doing some thinking about it myself. He sounded pleased. I did not tell him that the thinking was already done. The weekend before the wedding, Audrey drove out to Clover Ridge alone. First time in a while she'd come without Simone. She helped me repair a section of split-rail fencing along the drive, and we worked side by side for a couple of hours the way we used to when she was a teenager, and for a while it felt like nothing had changed. Then she sat down on the tailgate of my truck and looked out at the pasture, and she said, "Dad, has Philip said anything to you about the property?" I set my fence tool down, I said. She nodded. She looked down at her hands. I told Simone I didn't want them getting involved in that it wasn't their business. She paused. She said I was being naive, that I needed to think about my future. I sat down next to her. "Audrey," I said, Look at me, she did. This land is going to you and your brother, equally. That has always been the plan. Nothing about that has changed. I paused. But that's between you and me and Beckett. It's not a negotiating point. It's not a framework for somebody else to structure. You understand me? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, I know, Dad. We sat there for a while longer. The horses were moving along the fence line in the low afternoon light. A mockingbird was going through its whole repertoire in the cedar tree by the gate. She said, I think I already knew something was wrong. I didn't ask her to say more. Sometimes that's all a person can give you, and it's enough. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I think about that sometimes. The idea that someone might be sitting in a kitchen in Ohio at 7 in the morning, or on a couch in California at midnight, listening to an old man from East Texas tell his story. There's something humbling about that, something I'm grateful for. Because this story matters to me, and I hope some part of it matters to you. The wedding was on a Saturday in late October. The venue was a restored farmhouse property outside of Dripping Springs, all white twinkle lights and cedar beams and an outdoor ceremony space overlooking the hill country. It was genuinely beautiful, I'll give them that. I drove up Friday evening and stayed at a motel in town. Beckett drove separately and was already there when I arrived at the rehearsal dinner, sitting at the bar with a glass of iced tea, and that particular expression of his, that means he's paying attention to everything and saying nothing. The rehearsal dinner was fine. Philip Weston gave a toast that managed to be mostly about himself. Simone's mother cried. Audrey looked radiant and nervous and real. And I thought, whatever else is happening here, this part is real. She loves this woman. Even now, I believe that. Afterward, in the parking lot, Beckett walked with me to my truck and said, low and even, Philip asked me tonight about the property. Asked me directly whether you'd made any decisions about restructuring. I looked at him. What did you say? I said, Dad makes his own decisions, Beckett said. And I said it with a smile. He got in his truck and drove back to his motel room. The wedding was beautiful in the way that expensive, carefully planned things are beautiful. Every detail considered, every centerpiece placed by hand. The ceremony was under an oak tree that had been growing there since before anyone at that wedding was born. And when Audrey walked toward it in the afternoon light, I had to press my teeth together to keep from crying. She looked exactly like her mother. I sat in the front row next to Beckett. He handed me a folded handkerchief without looking at me. I used it. During the reception, Philip found me at a table near the back. He pulled out a chair across from me and sat down with the ease of someone who expects the world to accommodate them. I've been meaning to follow up on our conversation, he said. He had a glass of bourbon. He'd had a few. There was a looseness around his eyes. About the property frameworks, about making sure things are set up correctly going forward. I looked at him. He was confident. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin. He thought he was close. You know, he said, leaning in a little, I have a developer contact who would be very interested in that timber stand. We're talking about significant money, the kind that would set up your kids for life. He smiled. You've worked that land your whole life. Nobody would blame you for cashing out, enjoying the years you've got left. Across the room, Audrey was dancing with Simone. My daughter looked happy. I held on to that. Philip, I said, I appreciate what you're trying to do. He nodded. But the land's in a trust, I said, has been since February. My kids are equal beneficiaries. Nothing can be sold without both of their consent, and even then there are restrictions built in. The mineral rights are protected separately. I paused. Your developer contact won't be able to touch it. His smile didn't disappear. It just froze, like a photograph. What kind of trust? He said. The kind a good attorney sets up when someone's asking too many questions about your estate, I said. I said it quietly, without heat. It was just the truth. He set his bourbon glass down. Audrey know about this, he said. Audrey is a beneficiary, I said. That's all she needs to know. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with something that was trying to be disdain and landing closer to frustration. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made a few, I said. This isn't one of them. He walked back across the room. I watched him find his wife and say something to her, and I watched her face change. Then I watched him look for Simone, and I watched him find her on the dance floor, and I watched one thing pass between them. A look, just a look. And I saw Simone's expression shift in a way that my daughter, still dancing, couldn't see. Beckett materialized at my elbow a moment later with 2 glasses of sweet tea. How'd that go? He said. About how I expected, I said. He sat down and handed me a glass. We watched the dancing for a while. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. I asked him what. Mom used to say that land remembers who takes care of it. He took a sip of his tea. I always thought that was just something she said. She said a lot of things that turned out to be true, I said. He nodded. Yeah, the months after the wedding were difficult in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of anything dramatic. There was no confrontation, no explosion, no scene. Philip Weston stopped calling. The developer inquiry, whatever it was, went quiet. Simone was polite to me at Christmas, professionally warm, the way you are with someone you've decided to manage rather than engage with. But something had shifted in Audrey. She called more. She came out to Clover Ridge more. She started asking different questions, not about the property, but about the land itself. About the east pasture and why it always held water. About the stand of pines along the south fence that her grandfather had planted. About what the grazing leases covered and whether the rates were still fair. She was learning. One Sunday in March, she drove out alone, and we walked the whole perimeter of the property together, about 3 hours, just the 2 of us. She wore old boots she'd found in her old bedroom closet, her mother's boots, and they fit her almost perfectly. We didn't talk about Simone. We didn't talk about Philip Weston. We talked about the land. I showed her the creek that runs along the northeast corner, the one that's run every single year since my father bought this place in 1971. I showed her the spot where 2 timber stands meet, and how the light changes there in the afternoon, and how the deer use that corridor every single morning. I showed her the granite outcropping on the south ridge that my wife used to sit on and read. That long flat rock that holds the sun's warmth until almost midnight in the summer. Audrey stood on that rock for a long time. She just stood there with her face turned up to the light. I forgot how much I loved it out here, she said. I didn't say anything. I just stood beside her. I want to be clear about something before I finish telling you this story. Because I've heard from people over the years who've been through something similar. And I know there's a version of this story where things fall apart completely and don't come back together. I know that's true for some people. It was almost true for us. But Audrey is her mother's daughter, and her mother was the most clear-eyed person I have ever known. And somewhere in that year, my daughter looked at what was happening around her, and she made a decision about what she was going to do. She and Simone separated in the spring. I didn't ask Audrey for details, and she didn't offer many. She just said that they wanted different things, that it became clear their values weren't as aligned as she'd thought, and that it was better to know that now. She moved back to Dallas. She still works in commercial real estate. She's good at it. She calls every Sunday, and sometimes on a Friday evening, she drives out to Clover Ridge, and we sit on the porch and watch the light change over the east pasture. And she asks me questions about the land, and I answer them. And somewhere in that conversation, her mother is still present, in the way that people you love are always present when you're paying attention. I've had 64 years on this earth, most of them on this land or close to it. Here's what I've learned, and I mean this in the plainest possible way. There are people who see what you've built and ask how they can help you protect it. And there are people who see what you've built and start calculating how to get a piece of it. Learning to tell the difference is not cynicism, it's wisdom. And it takes time, and sometimes it costs you something to learn it. My late wife used to say, "The land knows who belongs to it." The people who walk it carefully, who pay attention to what it's telling them, who come back to it not because they want something from it, but because they love it. The land knows. It responds to them differently. You can feel it. I believe her. I believe it more every year. The pines are still there. The creek is still running. The deer still move through that corridor in the south every morning, like they have somewhere important to be. And on Sunday evenings, sometimes, my daughter sits on her mother's rock and turns her face up to whatever light is left in the sky. That's everything. That's what I fought to protect. That's the lesson.